Well, Dr David Millhouse, thank you for joining us. You've been very busy in the last few years conducting some fairly extensive research into what you call systemic and cyclical failure in the financial sector. Obviously, that's a topic that has become more topical in the last 12 months or so by way of the Royal Commission. So firstly, what exactly do you mean by financial product failure? And can you give us a sense of the scale of the problem?
Well, I certainly, Alex, and thank you for having me here, but I've spent the last 5 years studying court judgments from all of the senior courts across the country in what I've categorised as non-bank financial entities. So that's quite a wide-ranging group, and it does include the wealth management parts of the banks. And what I was interested to find out, given that it's not just the Hayne Royal Commission, but also the Productivity Commission and the Hayden Royal Commission and others, including parliamentary inquiries, what I was really anxious to find out is the scale of the problem and the underlying legal reasons as to how Australian investors and beneficiaries have been so badly afflicted. So it's been taking what is a massive amount of unstructured information and converting it into structured empirical data upon which future policy can be based. So, as I say, it's been a labour of love, Alex, for this last 5 years, and really what I think are some very, very significant findings, and the conclusions are very sympathetic with those of Dyson Hayden and Kenneth Hayne. And that is that we do have systemic problem in Australian law, in financial products and financial services. We've to date tried to address those by accretive statutory change across a whole range of statutes, but the underlying problems are deeper than that. And Hayne actually gets to it on page 494 to 496 of volume 1 of his final report. And that is the need to simplify the law and ensure that all in the investment chain focus on the intent of the law and not just box-ticking compliance, which today is what we have.
So you mentioned there Kenneth Hayne's views on the systemic problems, but famously, of course, in his interim report, the Royal Commissioner also said that we need to focus on enforcing the laws that already exist. In your thesis, David, you seem to suggest that there are weaknesses in the law as it is at the moment, which has directly led to investor losses or product failure or indeed misconduct. So is Kenneth Hayne wrong on that?
Well, Hayne's report and his recommendations are really in two parts. A lot of the disappointment that you see reported publicly on Hayne is to do with the recommendations, which for the most part are tactical. But the real message that he has is that there is an underlying cultural problem, and he talks specifically about the need of the confluence between law and morality. And in fact, Dyson Hayden in his Royal Commission report came to the similar conclusion, where he talks about culture and taint and the diffusion of unhealthy culture across the whole financial sector. So what Hayne specifically says is that the bigger challenge, which is the simplification of the law and focusing on the intent of the law to meet community expectations and norms, is such a large job that the specific tactical recommendations should not have to wait until that job is completed or even commenced. And I would hope that the research that I can contribute to the community is, and particularly the empirical basis of it, is the start of that process.
So just on that more cultural front, you take aim specifically at our approach to financial regulation. You say, David, that this is impeding Australia's goal to become a true global financial centre. What do you mean by that?
Well, in many respects, Australia is an outlier when it comes to its financial sector regulation compared with other jurisdictions. And this has been the subject in part of quite a lot of research from Mark Johnson, for instance, who did two research reports going back to 2009 as to how Australia can become a world financial centre. The problem with that is that both for the export of Australian financial products and for the import of foreign capital, particularly to our SME sector, that the law has significant disconsonances and impediments to those two processes. Now, in part, this is being addressed in the new Part 8, Chapter Part A and B of the Corporations Act, which permits some Australian products to be exported to other Southeast Asian countries and vice versa. That's really only the start of a process. But Australia has this enigma in the use of its trust structures, particularly for collective investment schemes. And I know of fund managers, for instance, in London, that will not invest in such devices because since the advent of the Managed Investment Acts in 1998, we've effectively destroyed the separation between trustee and promoter. So, you know, people around the world, in my experience, have called this the poacher gamekeeper model in Australia, where there's not the separation of power and it leads directly to conflicts of interest and conflicts of duty.
So you say that we are
dealing with these related parties.
You say, David, that we are behind our global peers on that particular issue. You yourself, of course, have some first-hand experience of the pointier end of the regulatory system. You entered an enforceable undertaking with APRA in 2013 relating to what the prudential regulator says was your directorship of the now defunct Trio Capital. How has that experience influenced your perspective on these issues and indeed your subsequent research?
Well, it was certainly one of the triggers to commence this research back in 2013. To be clear, crystal clear, I have never been a director of anything called Trio Capital or anything called Trio. I was certainly a director of Tolhurst Group in 2003, which became Astara Group in 2004, and I actually left the board of that entity in mid-05, having written a 5-page memorandum to the other directors, complaining about corporate governance standards and related party transactions in particular. So I was, as I say, never involved in what happened with what then became Trio many years later and many boards of directors later.
And in terms of the problems, David, that entity ultimately came to experience, do you say that that is part of these systemic and cyclical problems in the system rather than mismanagement of those funds or indeed personal greed? Were the investors that lost money in Trio a victim of these systemic problems?
Well, I think there were definitely systemic problems that occurred in Trio being effectively a conglomerate of financial services businesses. And it was not alone. There are many, many others. And if you look at the empirical data, a good part of the investor losses have been because of those conglomerates, which often are a mix of managed investment schemes and other funds management businesses. They often have superannuation business entities in them. And Hayne, I note, says that if you're a superannuation trustee, then that is all you do, and rightly so. What he doesn't specifically say is that the directors of that corporate trustee also have that constraint. So he started the process of looking at this process of vertical integration and conglomerate integration of various financial sector businesses. And many of them include everybody pretty much that's involved in the investment chain. So what you have to do, where we have to head, is quality assurance of the investment chain. And fundamental to that is defining who is a fiduciary in that chain and what those duties are, and as part of the process of eliminating conflicts of interest and duty, often derived from related parties in those entities.
Well, we're heading into an election cycle, of course, David. You've called for more holistic reform and not a piecemeal approach. We'll have to see whether your research gets picked up and whether indeed our policymakers have the appetite for that kind of reform. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex.